From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. In the blizzard of Trump's first 2 months back in office, you might not have thought much about his beardy deputy standing somewhere in the background. But James David Vance is increasingly involved, visible, and important.
So I think JD Vance's explosion onto the global stage happened in 3 parts. It was quite a rapid trifecta, certainly in this country. The first one was in mid-February at the Munich Security Conference, which is a gathering of global politicians and security analysts and security officials and bureaucrats. And it's traditional for an American president or vice president to come and talk to them. But this speech really shocked the room. Vance really berated the assemblage there and told them that they had strayed basically from their values, from American values on free speech.
I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action.
That they hadn't armed themselves sufficiently, and effectively they were a bunch of hypocrites because they talk a good game on Ukraine, but they leave it up to America to foot the bill.
Now, this is a security conference, and I'm sure you all came here prepared to talk about how exactly you intend to increase defense spending over the next few years in line with some new target. And that's great, because as President Trump has made abundantly clear, he believes that our European friends must play a bigger role in the future of this continent.
And the shock in that room was audible. This felt like a turning point. I think it's not an exaggeration to say a turning point in world history, because it became apparent that this was a very serious change of direction that was happening, and Europe would have to adapt. The next big moment for JD Vance comes about 2 weeks later in the Oval Office. A meeting between Trump, President Zelensky of Ukraine, and Vance. What happened was that the meeting went radically off the rails, and we all saw it. And Zelensky and Vance in particular came not to blows, but to sort of verbal blows.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
And this again shocked the world. Again, it was the tone, but also actually you just don't normally see a meeting like that devolve in that way. And Trump was quite happy to let Vance do it. And then the final moment was probably most important in this country.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for being with us.
Good to see you, man.
Appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Let's go back to the Oval Office Friday.
He went on Sean Hannity's Fox News show and did an interview with Hannity. Hannity was asking about various, European plan for peace in Ukraine. And Vance said,
the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years.
Now, everyone in Britain pretty much interpreted this as a direct insult, really, because Britain has fought several wars with America in recent decades, and hundreds, if not thousands, of British men and women have died in those wars, and we've all seen their coffins come back to this country. So it was seen as a massive slap in the face. These 3 events, I think, launched JD Vance into the public consciousness, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in this country he became something of a hate figure for a lot of people, or certainly a villain, the new baddie, if you like, and suddenly he was a name on everyone's lips.
How did he make it there? And what does his complicated journey to the almost top tell us about what he'll do next? The story today: who is JD Vance?
So my name is Josh Glancy. I am news review editor at the Sunday Times. I've just written a piece about JD Vance, and it's really a profile of his time in office so far. So I've been talking to his advisors, his friends, and political allies to try and get a more rounded sense of who this guy is, what his goals in office are, and what the sort of explanations, if you like, for how he's gone about things.
Josh, you're not new to JD Vance in any way. You've been thinking and writing about him for a while. You met him, didn't you, back in, what year was it?
2017.
So where was that and why was that?
Yeah, so I was sent by the Sunday Times magazine to interview Vance. This was when his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, was soaring. And he'd become a literary superstar. And his memoir of this hardscrabble upbringing in Middletown, Ohio, and the kind of social decay and the kind of family dramas. And with the election of Trump, everyone was suddenly fascinated in the Midwest, in white working class voters, how they thought about the world. And so Vance had become this tribune for the white working class, for the forgotten middle America. And he stepped up as the intermediary, if you like, almost on behalf of a lot of the people that he grew up with and knew that voted for Trump.
But it was a very exceptional childhood, it sounded like, from that book. I mean, I can remember stories of, was it his grandmother pouring petrol over his grandfather or something like that after an argument?
His mum poured petrol over his grandfather and threatened to kill him and light him on fire during one row. I think when she died, there were almost 20 handguns found in the house. His mother was a drug addict, was arrested on occasion. On one occasion, she asked him to take a urine test for her. She drove down the freeway at 100 miles an hour and threatened to kill him or kill them both.
I said something or some conversation topic really ignited her temper, and then she just sped up. And she kept on saying, I'm just going to crash this car and kill us both. I'm going to crash this car and kill us both.
There was physical abuse. It was tough. I mean, it was really tough. And he wrote about that, and he wrote about how that shaped his worldview. And so when I met him, I went to Columbus, Ohio, where he'd just moved. He had been living on the West Coast, working for Peter Thiel, who's been something of his patron throughout.
Who a big Silicon Valley figure.
Yeah, Silicon Valley billionaire, kind of PayPal, Facebook, but also the first big Silicon Valley figure to come out for Trump way before anyone else did. And has always backed Vance intellectually, financially, politically. And Vance had come back to Ohio. He was talking a lot about the opioid crisis and about what fentanyl was doing to communities in the Midwest, including his own.
The things that I care most about are the opioid crisis, about solving some of the issues that I write about in the book. And you can only do that, I think, when you're actually close to the problems and when you're actually on the ground trying to help.
But he was also kind of deciding what to do with this extraordinary moment in his life. So it was a really interesting moment to meet him. He was also, I would say, at the beginning of his journey with Trump. So we met, I went to his house first, and then we met at a coffee house in Germantown in Columbus, which is a kind of nice bougie area where a lot of millennials live. And I met his wife, Usha, who's very nice. And we had a coffee for a couple of hours and we chatted. And it was a really interesting moment for him because, I mean, the big question I wanted to know from him was, what do you think of Trump? And do you believe in this guy? And at the time, he was still a no. He said, Trump is able to articulate the problem, but I don't believe he's got the solutions. And then the other big question was, are you going into politics? Because obviously he was already getting a mountain of speculation around that. And he was a maybe, but he talked about how the Republican Party wasn't really in the right place for him and had to do a lot more. He wanted to see it move into a better place before he considered being involved in politics. One might argue that he moved rather than the party, but, you know.
One of the reasons, I guess, why lots of people were wondering whether he was going to go into politics at that time is the interesting constituent parts in his background and, I guess, what underpins his political view of the world. He was somebody, correct me if I'm wrong, who had served in the forces and who had also been to Yale as well. So just explain what were the inputs at that point in Vance's head?
He'd gone into the Marines and worked as a journalist, but served in Iraq during the war.
A sort of non-combat role.
Non-combat role. But, he was very much there on a tour of service. He then got a scholarship to Yale Law School, and that's where he kind of arrives in the American elite. He's tutored by Amy Chua, who you may remember, the Tiger Mother, who's a very influential law tutor at Yale. And then he meets Peter Thiel, who comes to give a talk at Yale, follows up, emails him saying, I'd like to come and learn more from you. And ends up working for Thiel, goes to San Francisco. He's also met his wife Usha at that point. So suddenly he's gone from broken home in Middletown, Ohio, to working for a big venture capital firm and living the high life in San Francisco with a lovely wife and a Yale law degree.
And at that time, how does all of that congeal in his head and his politics? What was he explaining to you were his solutions to the problems he said Trump couldn't answer that point?
So I think initially he went to San Francisco and was on the track of joining the American, I guess you could call it liberal elite, but the coastal elite maybe is a better word. But something in him didn't like it, and something in him resisted it. And he found the scorn and the derision and the indifference towards people like him. Not him specifically, because he was impressing people, but towards people like him, towards his family, his background, the hillbillies, if you like. It just offended him. And he got angry about it, because there is an anger in JD Vance, and a kind of deep sense of frustration and irritation with some of the things he's seen. And he got angry, and he also found the world he encountered out there vapid. He found it disconnected. People seemed alienated from each other. He spoke to me how he has this very deep sense of place, and he wanted to go back to Ohio because the grass smelled a certain way, and he remembers kissing a girl on a certain street corner, and he likes knowing his neighbours and feeling like they're all from a certain place. He's very clannish. He's from that kind of Scots-Irish Appalachian background. They're very tribal. One of his ancestors was actually the guy who was involved in the first piece of violence of the Hatfield-McCoy rivalry, one of the great sort of clan fights of American history. I mention that to say it's quite a deep sense of identity he has.
It's identity politics.
But he has this incredibly strong sense of who he is. And he went to San Francisco and just felt like very uncomfortable with what he found there. And so he was moving back to Ohio and sort of reconnecting. And then Trump gets elected around that time as well. And so suddenly that vote has moved from the Democrats to the Republicans. There's a whole political earthquake happening, and he's trying to locate himself within it.
When you met him at this time in 2017, what did you make of him as a person? And what was he like?
I liked him. We're quite close in age. He's a couple of years older than me, which is worrying.
Sliding doors.
Yeah, right. Could have been me. He's quite funny. He's a good conversationalist. I mean, in many ways, he's another millennial with a beard who spends too much time online, is very interested in political discourse and conversation.
He could work here.
He could, in another world, I mean, he could have been a journalist. He was, in some ways, a journalist for a while. So I instinctively got on with him, and probably still would. I mean, I think we might disagree over more politics than we did then.
And I guess it's now apparent that maybe even at that point when you met him in 2017, he was soft launching, or at least putting the wheels into motion for a run in the Senate to represent Ohio. How does that journey take him in the years that continue?
So he's in Ohio for a few years. He moves politically, and I think he starts to get more interested in Trumpian politics, if you like.
And so you can imagine why he would then want to run as senator for Ohio. But to do that in 2022, we're talking about now, you do have to have the Trump seal of approval, don't you? Did he realise that and go about getting that?
Yeah, and it was a long journey for him because he'd said some pretty derisive stuff about Trump, which has been quoted ad nauseum. He said he could theoretically become America's Hitler. That was the most.
Can I read a few at you?
Yeah.
Trump makes people I care about afraid, immigrants, Muslims, etc. Because of this, I find him reprehensible. God wants better of us. After the Access Hollywood tape was released in the 2016 presidential campaign, fellow Christians, everyone is watching us. When we apologise for this man, Lord help us. So yeah, quite the journey, to quote you from earlier.
Right, so it's pretty strong stuff. But somewhere along the line, a couple of things happen. One is he is politically ambitious, and he realizes that to fulfill that ambition in this environment, Trump's the guy, right? You can't be an anti-Trump Republican. It's pointless. The whole thing's moved.
Yeah.
And so he says in an interview with Time magazine in 2021, that Trump is the leader of this movement. And if I actually care about these people and the things I say I care about, I need to just suck it up and support him. So that's pretty direct. Transparent acknowledgement that on some level, he's just going to have to suck it up. And there's obviously things he doesn't like about Trump. But it's not just a cynical political calculation. And I think that's a mistake people make with Vance sometimes. There is a genuine conversion that happens. He becomes more radical in his worldview. He's always had a kind of coterie of intellectuals and thinkers and political philosophers around him who he talks to more and more. And I think he starts to rethink the way he views the world. I think he starts to see the kind of liberal, I'm going to use the word woke here, what in that world they call the cathedral, the kind of liberal establishment that has control, in his view, of American culture, of academia, of publishing, of Hollywood. And he sees it as this grand cathedral. And he really starts to radicalize in terms of what is required to defeat this opponent.
But it's one thing to go through that transformation or realization and get on board with Trump, suck it up, as you quoted him as saying. But it's another to convince Donald Trump of that.
Yeah. So that's his big challenge. He goes to Mar-a-Lago in, I think, February 2021 with Peter Thiel, who was a very early donor to Trump and supporter of, and he effectively goes to kiss the ring. And you can imagine with Trump that you probably have to physically get on your knees and kiss the ring to kiss. Yeah, this isn't just a metaphor. But he does. And he, at this point, is planning to run for a Senate seat that's coming up in Ohio. A lot of this is brokered by Don Jr., Trump's son, who becomes an early fan of Vance. And some of the people around him also become a fan of Vance because, as they say, he's one of our guys. I've been talking to a lot of these people the last few weeks for this piece. And what really comes across is they see him as one of them. In fact, Don Jr. says at one point, I don't know why he wasn't with us in the first place. Don Jr. was particularly impressed with the stuff he said about the Ukraine war early on.
Right from the beginning saying, we shouldn't be funding this.
Yeah. And so he goes and kisses the ring. He gets Trump's endorsement for that Senate race, which is pretty important. And he wins it. Suddenly he's in the Senate, he's in his late 30s, he's a superstar. He's a political superstar.
And then how does he get on the ticket with Donald Trump? Is that Don Jr. again?
I think Don Jr. is the kind of fulcrum, definitely. I think they persuaded, or Trump was persuaded or came to think that JD Vance was one of us and that he could be on the team, he could be trusted ideologically, and, if and when the time comes to take up the mantle post-Trump, that he would be a great option to do that, potentially. He's young, he's eloquent, he's passionate, he's capable, and so Trump came round to that idea. But it was a decision that really doubled down on the future of MAGA and of Trumpism, and it showed a lot of confidence.
JD Vance is doing a phenomenal job. I picked the best athlete, and I could have picked anyone that would have been great, but JD had an incredible life. He's conservative, but he really is like all of us. We're all sort of conservative, but what we really are is we have common sense, right?
Josh, we've been tracking the journey of JD Vance, now US Vice President, of course. We were talking earlier about what happened at the Munich Security Conference, where he gave lots of European leaders a bit of a dressing down at that sort of NATO jamboree, and also that incredible scene in the Oval Office with President Zelensky and really taking the lead in laying into him. What do you think that told us about JD Vance 2025 political view of the world?
Well, I think it certainly shows a man extremely confident in himself and in his own skin at this point. I think we interpreted those moments as basically America abandoning Europe. One person in politics here said to me, he embodies the America we don't understand. He embodies the America that we actually don't have a special relationship with, that kind of Midwestern worldview that actually doesn't connect with a lot of people in Britain. And I think people interpreted what he was saying as, we're not interested. We're not interested in funding Ukraine. We're not interested in, frankly, the transatlantic alliance. So one of the reasons I wanted to write this piece was to explore how true is that, really, because these are pretty seismic changes to the world, if true. A guy very close to him said, this is silly. He said, JD loves Europe. JD cares about Europe. JD's passionate about, he loves going on holiday to Europe. He thinks of Europe as the foundation of Western civilization, which is like the thing he cares about, you know, how he sees the world. But he also sees Europe as being potentially in something of a death spiral.
I've heard a lot about what you need to defend yourselves from, and of course that's important. But what has seemed a little bit less clear to me, and certainly I think to many of the citizens of Europe, is what exactly it is that you're defending yourselves for.
He thinks that we've lost control of our borders. He thinks that we have lost vitality in our economy. He thinks we're mired in our own bureaucracy. He thinks we've curtailed free speech.
Something he said to Keir Starmer directly. And he basically sees a civilization in quite rapid decline, but he wants, this is the argument, he wants Europe to pull itself out of this spiral. So I think one really interesting thing I discovered that I think tells us quite a lot about how Vance is viewing the world is that he recently read Julian Jackson's magisterial biography of Charles de Gaulle. When you say magisterial, it's sort of plus 700 pages.
It's really long.
Yeah.
But it's also very good.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I was told that he found interesting about this book is he liked de Gaulle's willingness to confront circumstances and not be precious about his ego, which I think is quite telling.
Yes.
And he admired de Gaulle's willingness to change to meet the circumstances he faced. Interesting. Again, the pragmatism of high politics. But also de Gaulle, of course, was the man who argued for European strategic autonomy and for European friendship with America, but also independence from it. And it was really the British worldview, actually, that wanted to basically create a transatlantic dependency. So I think de Gaulle represents for him someone who has a vision of a Europe that he wants to see enacted. But he doesn't see it as America's job to prop it up. And actually, more than that, he thinks that America propping Europe up has infantilized it.
What about how he views how the United States is currently set up?
Well, for our older listeners, if any of them remember Dwight Eisenhower's presidency in the 1950s, you'd probably say he was the last good American president, or at least that was the last time America was in the kind of place that JD Vance would like to see it. So the sexual revolution, the kind of cultural revolution of the 60s, and the arrival of liberalism and also of kind of foreign adventurism in American foreign policy has basically destroyed the America that Vance loves, or is destroying, I suppose, and that the fight back is now on. So no more foreign wars, no more Vietnam, no more Iraq, no more Afghanistan. He wants to completely end the fentanyl trade. But that's reflective of a deeper desire to reshape the American economy in a way that benefits working class and middle class people. So the fentanyl epidemic, or the opioid epidemic, is a really good example of kind of rapacious vulture capitalism, sort of taking advantage of America's kind of economic structure to effectively just exploit working people and get them hooked on drugs and make billions of dollars from it. So having an economy where things like that don't happen or can't happen, America's stopped trying to be the world's policeman, and it's no longer America's role to try and order all of the world's problems in the way it wants. So instead it would be the kind of primus inter pares of nations, the top dog, but not necessarily the policeman. Get immigration down to a trickle. Again, that comes back to that point about protecting working class people, protecting their jobs, protecting their housing, protecting their entitlements and their benefits, and just allowing them to flourish instead of bringing in more and more cheap labour from south of the border. And as we mentioned earlier, just tear the fat liberal bureaucracy to shreds. I mean, really shred it and, start from the ground up on that. And embrace technological greatness, embrace the dynamism of technology. I mean, that's what will keep his Silicon Valley buddies happy. I think the key line in all of this, though, is something he says in his Republican convention speech when he accepts the nomination. And he says,
"To the people of Middletown, Ohio, and all the forgotten communities in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and every corner of our nation, I promise you this: I will be a vice president who never forgets where he came from."
And he tells a friend afterwards, who told me this, that was the closest he came to tearing up in the speech. Because I think it's really the keystone to almost his whole personality and his politics. He ultimately always sees himself as fighting on their behalf.
Religion, particularly Christianity, has a lot of impacts on US politics. We always think of the evangelical vote and how that has influenced politics, you know, Reagan onwards and the rest. What does Vance's Christianity, and specifically his Catholicism, because he converted only a few years ago, is that right? What has that done to his worldview, his politics?
Yeah, so he converted in 2019. Around that time, he became close with an academic writer called Rod Dreher and another called Patrick Deneen. They've both been really big influences on him. And he found Catholicism appealing. I think it was a reflection of the fact that he was looking for something. He was attracted by Catholicism's sense of order, the fact that it's something old and substantial and has a very sort of rigid and established tradition that he could work within. But I think also this is a guy who has never really known stability. Life has felt very messy and chaotic and unsettling in his early years. People have often said with Vance, obviously his father was absent, that he's looking for father figures or looking for parental figures. So Amy Chua was one, Peter Thiel is another. You could argue Donald Trump is another one.
God
is obviously the ultimate, paternal figure. So I don't know that it massively explains or changes his worldview. I think it's more of a symptom. It shows how he's moving into a kind of post-liberal place at that time, talking to a lot of Catholic intellectuals who are thinking about, life beyond liberalism.
Which is what?
Well, for example, a world that, say, rejects trans ideology, that would be something very concrete. A world that has much more of a adherence to conservative norms around, sex before marriage or homosexuality or the structure of the family being preeminent. A world that is more ordered, maybe more hierarchical even, but that is perhaps more stable. I think they see modern liberalism as kind of decadent and feckless and just lost. And it's created this world of hollow relationships and empty communities and broken societies. And they want to sort of put it all back together into something a bit more cohesive. What he does think is that a form of revolution is needed in America. I think he thinks that things like the administrative state, America's bureaucracy, is completely liberal and is sort of this quite deep-rooted obstacle to American flourishing. And it really serves the elites in America, and it serves to protect and enrich elite interests. And in order to reshape the country so that people all over the country, people like him, or people like the people he grew up with, can benefit in the great American kind of wealth journey, you do need to overhaul that state and you need to dismantle it. And you need to be radical while you're doing it. And that's where he gets on with Musk. So he's, I'm told, good friends with Elon Musk. They clearly don't agree on everything, like issues like immigration. But this idea that the state needs to be completely uprooted and reformed, I think they do agree on.
And that's interesting because there he is, the link between some of the different factions battling for Donald Trump's attention, which is the MAGA Republicans and then the Silicon Valley types. Your Steve Bannons and your Elon Musks. And in JD Vance is the sort of nexus.
Yeah, I think that's right. Potentially. I mean, look, this is all very febrile. There is a long way to go before we start talking about 2028 election. But you're completely right. He does act as a bridge. Peter Thiel is, his patron, who is the sort of archdeacon of the Silicon Valley Trumpists.
To get back to Catholicism.
Yeah, quite. But he is true MAGA. And the base love him. They call him 48, implying that he'll be the 48th president. They really like him. They like how feisty he is, how pugnacious, how straight-spoken. They love it when he goes on liberal media shows and really gives it to them, no holds barred. But also, I think on some level, some of them recognise that he is more coherent than Trump. He is more rational than Trump. If you want to turn Trumpism from a kind of emotional impulse into a political program, then JD Vance is your guy. And so you speak to people in Trump world who are Vance fans, and you kind of sense, they'd never be disloyal to the boss publicly, but you sense their excitement about this guy because, if they can get him into office, suddenly you're looking at really a complete sea change in American public life. And they sense that he's the guy who could deliver on the promise of Trumpism. Whereas with Trump himself, I don't need to tell anyone what Donald Trump's like. Every day is chaos, the volatility, the incoherence, sometimes the madness of it all does somewhat obstruct the political program.
But as you alluded to there, Trump's patronage is still quite key for success in American politics, Republican politics. And Donald Trump has recently been asked on the television.
Do you view Vice President JD Vance as your successor, the Republican nominee in 2028?
And he said, no.
He did, although I actually rewatched that clip before coming on here, and I think what he meant was, in as much as I'm going to interpret Donald Trump's mind, but I think what he meant was I haven't decided. I'm not going to I'm not going to give an endorsement now. I've just come into office. I'm not going to say he's the guy. But he then went on to say,
But he's very capable. I mean, I don't think that I think you have a lot of very capable people. So far, I think he's doing a fantastic job. It's too early. We're just starting.
I think Trump is impressed with him. I've been told by many people that they have a genuine friendship, that they have a very easy relationship. And so, no, he's not an anointed successor thus far, at least not in Trump's mind, who will want to, I presume, sort of play him off against someone else. It's not impossible that one of Trump's sons could put their hat in the ring. I would doubt that. But he's certainly in pole position, if we are thinking long term. And as long as Vance can play the difficult game of keeping Trump happy and maintaining his belief in Vance's loyalty, then I think he's very well placed.
Josh Glancy, news review editor for The Sunday Times. You will find more on Vance, Trump and co at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. And we'll put a link to an episode we did on those competing factions in the White House, Bannon versus Musk, in the description to this episode. That is it from us. Today's producer was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition was by Maula Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.